Thank you, everyone. My name is Katharine Viner. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian, and I'm delighted at tonight's Alternative MacTaggart lecture at the Guardian Edinburgh International Television Festival to welcome a woman who is one of the most successful and interesting politicians in Britain. She presided over what playwright David Gregg called Scotland's Summer of Love, when the whole country seemed to be debating its future street by street. She delivered an 85% turnout in the Scottish referendum, which she lost but somehow won. She was labelled the most dangerous woman in Britain, and then by Piers Morgan, the most dangerous woman in the world, while posting massive personal popularity ratings. She presided over an extraordinary election result, with her party taking 56 of 59 seats in Scotland. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the leader of the Scottish National Party, Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Kath, and can I say what a pleasure it is for me as the first woman First Minister of Scotland to be introduced by the first woman Editor-in-Chief of The Guardian. Congratulations. You know, there can't be too many events where the list of former speakers includes Vice President Al Gore, Professor Germaine Greer, Professor Brian Cox, and Ant and Dec. It's a distinguished and fairly eclectic list, and it's one that I'm absolutely delighted to be adding my name to today. Now, I'm aware that the last few Alternative MacTaggart lectures have taken the form of interviews, actually, rather than lectures, so I want to make sure that we do have some time for questions this evening. Later on in my remarks, I'm going to share some of my views on BBC Charter Renewal and set out how the Scottish Government will contribute positively to that very important process. But before that, I thought it might be useful to offer some personal reflections on the media and on broadcasting in particular that are really drawn from my own personal and very recent experiences. I've been a politician in the public eye for 16 years now, although I'm well aware I don't look nearly old enough. But over the past couple of years, as a result of the global coverage of the referendum, becoming First Minister, and obviously the recent general election campaign, there has been a dramatic increase in the level of media exposure and scrutiny that I experience. And of course, those years have also seen the continued growth of social media, which has completely changed the way that all of us, politicians, media and the public, communicate, interact, source and place stories. And that has taken place alongside a growing and, in my opinion, long overdue focus on how the media represents who we are, in particular how women and other minority groups, as well as the different nations that comprise the multinational UK, are presented and represented. Now, all of that has, and no doubt will continue, to shape my views about the future of the media in all of its forms and the challenges that it faces. Let me start firstly with diversity, an issue very, very close to my heart and one that I've got some personal experience of. You know, for an industry that prides itself, usually rightly, on being creative and innovative, an industry that is driven by new technology and the need to constantly be anticipating the changing values and tastes of its audiences, it genuinely sometimes surprises me how, dare I say it, old-fashioned the media can sometimes feel. And the portrayal of women in the media is, in my view, a case in point. Challenging the sexist portrayal of women and increasing the presence of strong female role models in all walks of life is something that I feel incredibly strongly about. One of the things that really moved me when I became First Minister at the end of last year was how many women and girls said how much it meant to them personally, not to see me, but to see a woman in the most senior political office in Scotland. And when I see sexist media portrayals of public figures, I don't really get upset on my own behalf. I've become, I think, quite inured to it over the years. But I do get really angry about the potential impact on women and young girls who might be driven away from pursuing a career in politics or public life because of it. And unfortunately, I speak to many who would say that they are driven away from a career in public life because of that. And the fact is that what broadcasters and print journalists portray and what they say really matters, even in this age of scepticism about the media and what it tells us. Journalists are people who are listened to and people who command real respect. And that brings with it, I think, great responsibility. And of course, this point goes well beyond news and politics. Women make up 52% of the population, and yet twice as many men as women feature in TV programming. Despite the enormous successes of the lionesses and athletes like Ailey Child or Jessica Ennis-Hill, women in sport receive far less coverage and prominence than their male counterparts. Older female reporters have had to battle to stay on screen while their male equivalents hold premium presenting roles well past retirement age. None of that, in my view, is acceptable in 2015. It probably wasn't acceptable 20 years ago. It's certainly not acceptable today. Young girls and women are entitled, just as much as men and boys are, to see positive, or rather fair, representations of themselves on screen. And of course, diversity issues don't just relate to women. It's more than a decade now since Greg Dyke called the BBC hideously white. But just last year, Tony Hall had to set new targets to increase the representation of racial minorities on screen and in management. Now, the situation is improving. I don't question that for a second. But the pace of change, the pace of improvement, often seems to be glacial. What encourages me now, though, is that the absence of women and the lack of diversity on screen is being increasingly and often directly challenged by the viewing public. I know that when I'm asked questions in interviews about my appearance or why I don't have children, in other words, questions that a male politician would almost certainly never be asked, there is often a reaction to that online. And when people make comments that might be considered inappropriate or sexist, or when women are completely absent from a television discussion, viewers and readers are very likely to use social media to make their opinions known. That happened, in fact, just this week when an article by a serious journalist in a serious publication asked, apparently seriously, if Yvette Cooper and Liz Kendall had the looks for leadership. Now, I have to admit, I was one of those who took to Twitter to complain about that particular article, which takes me to the next of my observations, which is the rise of social media. One of the really striking developments that politicians have had to address in recent years has been that connection between social media and traditional media, the way in which they both reinforce and challenge each other. As it happens, I was quite a late convert to Twitter, but now, to be frank, I cannot imagine doing my job as a politician without it. Since I started tweeting, I've sent more than 11,000 tweets. Incidentally, every single one of them has been typed and sent by me personally, for better or worse. And I've received in that time thousands more. And the ability to communicate so directly and so quickly with lots and lots of people is hugely valuable. But I tell you this, it's also hugely empowering, because it allows me, if I so choose, to bypass, or on occasion, to challenge traditional media, to point out factual errors or misquotes or get messages out to people without having to wait for the broadcast news bulletins or the next day's papers. And I certainly learned the value of that during the general election campaign when the Telegraph carried the allegation that I had told the French ambassador that I wanted David Cameron to win the election. Now, before Twitter, it would have taken me hours for my rebuttal of that story, published late on a Friday night, to get it into print or onto television. And of course, then it would have been up to the media to decide what prominence that story was given. Instead, within minutes of that story breaking, people could read a tweet from me saying that it was 100% untrue. And not long after that, they were also able to read on Twitter that the French ambassador had said that it wasn't true. Though here, I think I really should give credit where it's due, because although it was on Twitter, on social media, that people read the ambassador's response, it was actually a print journalist, a Guardian print journalist, no less, in the form of Sev Carel, who put it there. Sev had used that, old journalistic tactic of simply phoning up and asking. Something that the Telegraph never thought to do with me before they published the story. But that's not the real point I'm making here. The real point is that today, because of social media, there is actually a real chance that the lie won't have got much beyond the end of the road before the truth has its boots on and is tearing after it. And I think that's a really good and healthy development. Indeed, perhaps that is a more effective check and balance on the traditional media than any formal sense of press regulation could ever be, and without the same concerns about erosion of press freedom that come with more formal press regulation. So I'm an enormous fan of the social media revolution, but there is a big caveat to that. Just as for any sensible politician, Twitter and Facebook will be no substitute for face-to-face engagement with the public, nor should they be substitutes for proper news gathering by print or broadcast media. An over-reliance by organisations on social media as a source of easy stories risks, I think, sacrificing some of the best traditions of news gathering and investigative journalism in Scotland and across the UK. Traditional and social media should complement and reinforce as well as challenge each other. Now, the final and no doubt much more controversial set of personal reflections that I want to share with you come from my experience of the referendum campaign and the role of the media, particularly the broadcast media, in covering that campaign. Now, it may be worth saying that I don't venture onto this ground without a degree of trepidation. Firstly, I'm very aware that anything I say here might sound like a politician complaining about coverage that she didn't like. Now, that's not my intention. I would hope that journalists who know me would concede that I don't do that very often. I'm not saying I never do it at all, but I don't do it very often. And secondly, I know that some people might choose to interpret what I say here as me accusing broadcasters, and let's be frank about this, the BBC in particular, of being biased in how they covered the referendum. So let me be clear, I am not saying there was institutional bias in the BBC's referendum output. However, there were occasions when its coverage through oversight, apparent ignorance of some of the detail of an issue, or as a result of simply following the agenda of openly partisan print media, I think lapsed from the objective output the referendum deserved into what could be seen as partial or at times pejorative. Now, I don't doubt the effort and integrity that went into the corporation's coverage. And for the record, I think that the BBC, and BBC Scotland in particular, has some of the finest political journalists in the land. But that was undermined on occasion by these lapses, some of which have actually been recognised and flagged up by the BBC's own internal processes subsequent to the vote. And let me expand on two issues that I think were important. You know, the referendum at its heart was a choice of two different futures for Scotland. To become independent or stay in the UK, both had consequences. But there often seemed to be an imbalance in how these two futures and the consequences that would flow from either yes or no were scrutinised. Independence was heavily analysed, and absolutely rightly so. In fact, given that independence was the change option, I'd absolutely accept that it was appropriate for it to be the more scrutinised of the two propositions. But the status quo and the consequences of voting no sometimes appeared not really to be analysed at all. You know, for example, if you had a news package looking at what might happen to state pensions if we voted yes, that would be balanced by giving somebody like me the chance to say that, no, state pensions would be perfectly safe in an independent Scotland. It wouldn't be balanced, and perhaps it would have been better balanced by counter-analysis of what the value of state pensions might be in 5 or 10 years if we voted no and let Westminster continue to make the decisions. And that was often compounded by the fact that the daily agenda of broadcasters, and perhaps the BBC in particular, would often follow what was in the morning papers. And given that most papers were anti-independence, as was their right to be, it would be the reports casting doubt on, for example, the security of pensions that made the splash. Any reports pointing to the erosion of pensions as a result of Westminster decisions would usually be buried somewhere deep inside. So more often than not, it was the attack on independence that led the news coverage. And I think the sense of overall balance would have been enhanced if news reports had more often been led by critical analysis of the status quo. In fact, BBC Network's James Cook, a hugely respected face of referendum coverage and many other things, reflected this point in an interview earlier this year when he said that while the Yes campaign was rightly questioned more and proposals for independence rightly put to the test, perhaps more could have been done to ask, is it a good thing if we remain as part of the Westminster system? Now, my second point flows from what I think was best about the referendum, the extent to which people in Scotland became deeply engaged in the campaign and the sophistication of their knowledge and understanding. You know, by last summer, voters in Scotland had a very, very detailed understanding of the big issues in the debate. Highly technical discussions about optimal currency zones, lender of last resort arrangements, or whether the EU treaties would allow expulsion of part of a member state. These were not the preserve of politicians or experts. These were the topic of conversation at dinner tables, in pubs and cafes, in hairdressers, in street corners and bus stops, literally in every single corner of the country. So when some network journalists came into the campaign very late on and reported on issues that had been discussed in detail in Scotland for months, what people sometimes heard sounded less than fully informed. Indeed, the BBC's Audience Council for Scotland touched on that point on Monday in its annual report. It said that BBC network programmes overall didn't engage with the issues until too late a stage, and that meant that some had been less well informed and that this diluted the value of the coverage at both Scottish and UK levels. Now, the point is that to some people, a journalist appearing to be not fully informed can sound like a journalist not being entirely impartial. Now, I don't say any of this just to rake over old ground, but instead to try to offer some rational explanation for why so many people felt unhappy with how the referendum was covered, and so that we can all try to move forward. Of course, the easy thing for broadcasters to do would be to dismiss the complaints and the protests as intolerance of a free media or of opposing opinions. But I think it needs to recognise, as the Audience Council has already done, that some of these complaints were well-founded. The frustration that many felt was not born out of a misplaced desire to control the media, but from a genuine concern that a level playing field didn't always appear to be in operation. So even if they don't agree with my analysis, and I expect many won't, I hope that the broadcast media, and given its unique and special status in our national life, the BBC in particular, will reflect on that, seek to understand and respond to it. Because while last year's debate is behind us, the need for the diversity of the UK to be reflected in our media becomes ever more important. And that's probably an appropriate point to move beyond personal reflections and onto some wider policy issues. Because the referendum, and I would suggest the general election campaign, which, remember, consisted of 4 different campaigns in 4 different nations, leading to 4 different outcomes, illuminate a key question for the media as a whole, and perhaps for the BBC in particular. How do broadcasters, which have a duty to cover all of the UK, reflect the differences within and between the 4 nations of the UK? Now, that issue has exercised the mind of broadcasting from the very beginning. There's a natural tension between reflecting the diversity of individual experiences and creating special moments that bring people together. But since this is the first time that the Scottish Government has ever had a formal role in the BBC Charter Renewal process, it's maybe worth outlining our initial views on how the BBC might adapt to the changes that we are seeing across the UK. But I want to start just briefly by talking about our approach to Charter Renewal and our significant concerns about how the UK Government has approached the process so far. You know, 5 years ago, the coalition government essentially reduced the BBC's budget by more than £300 million by forcing it to take on responsibility for the World Service, S4C, and the expansion of broadband. It made that decision in secret over a few days and announced it as part of the spending review. Now, that method of decision-making was widely criticised. In fact, the House of Commons Culture Committee, which at the time was chaired by John Whittingdale, went so far as to say that it undermined confidence in the government and the BBC's commitment to accountability and transparency. So it's quite mystifying, I think, that within a month of being appointed as Culture Secretary, John Whittingdale has supported a new licence fee settlement which is equally far-reaching in its consequences and was again negotiated in secret. I think that represents a breach of the terms of the UK Government's Memorandum of Understanding with Scotland. So a key message from me is that the rest of the renewal process needs to be more transparent. For our part, the Scottish Government will do our best to find out what viewers in Scotland want. We've begun consulting broadcasters, independent producers, the creative industries, and the public, and we're speaking regularly to the BBC. We want to understand its views on what's desirable and achievable as part of identifying the best proposals. That consultation will have a big impact on the detail of what we propose, but I'll set out some key principles just now. The first is simple. We must have a strong and independent BBC. Its services are valued, so we want Charter Renewal to improve the BBC, not diminish it. The BBC should continue to provide mass audience programming. You know, if the BBC does nothing except find niches that aren't served by commercial broadcasters, it really risks losing the widespread popular support on which all of its wider programming rests. And of course, editorial independence is vital. Every politician will disagree at some point with coverage. I've just done so myself. That's legitimate, but it doesn't take away from the fundamental point that independence from government is essential to our public service broadcasters. Charter Renewal must protect and strengthen that principle. And the second point is that funding should be universal. We agree that people who use the iPlayer should pay the licence fee, and actually we're quite drawn to the idea of a progressive income-based levy rather than a flat rate fee. So we'll consider that carefully, maybe not for immediate implementation, but as a medium-term funding solution. And however it's raised, there's no doubt that a fairer proportion of the licence fee should be invested here in Scotland. My third point is that the BBC needs to reflect the nations and regions of the UK more effectively than it does. It's, after all, the national broadcaster for Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as the UK as a whole. Many of you will recall that when devolution was first introduced in the late 1990s, John Birt lobbied Tony Blair to block the proposal for a Scottish Six. An interesting example, perhaps, of how resistant to change the BBC can sometimes be. But it's also interesting to note John Birt's reasoning. He said in his autobiography that the BBC should follow constitutional change. It was not our role to lead it. Now, I don't accept that altering one news programme would have constituted leading constitutional change, but that's probably beside the point. I think the criticism that should be levied at the BBC is not that it is trying to lead constitutional change, it's that it has totally failed to follow it. The UK has changed dramatically since devolution, but broadcasters are still catching up with the consequences. And although that poses questions for all public service broadcasters, the issue is most acute with the BBC. Now, we've seen progress in recent years. For example, the share of network commissions from Scotland is far above 2006 levels, but that progress has been slow, and it's striking that in some areas, political coverage, for example, it's been STV that has often led the way. You know, STV was 3 years ahead of the BBC in establishing a dedicated late-night programme for Scottish current affairs. And although network production has increased in the last decade in Scotland, it fell back again last year. Indeed, Ofcom has reported concerns about the sustainability of Scotland's production sector, not least because increases in production are often due to so-called lift and shift policies. But the most serious challenge for the BBC in Scotland is what its own annual report demonstrates. In Scotland, less than half of the audience thinks that the BBC accurately reflects their lives in terms of its news and current affairs coverage. And Scotland is the only part of the UK where that's the case. The last couple of years, as we know, have been extraordinary for Scotland, and the BBC have done a great deal to reflect the events that have contributed to that. But the figures suggest that it maybe hasn't reflected them quite as fully or as meaningfully as people wanted it to. The question now then is, what does all of this mean for the future? I think there are minor changes that the BBC should make, and I think they are the least we should expect. For example, we should have a better informed UK news network, which is as up to speed on issues in Scotland as its viewers. As part of that, BBC editors based in Scotland should have greater ability to influence UK reporting of Scottish issues. Another early important change would be to ensure a specific Scottish site for iPlayer programmes. Now, neither of these proposals require charter renewal. They're practical steps which would benefit viewers and which are long overdue. We've also heard proposals for greater use of opt-outs and more powers for the BBC commissioners based here. Now, they seem to me to fall short of what is needed, but they would definitely be an improvement and could pave the way for further progress. In short, proposals like that might bring the BBC into line with Scotland as it was in 1999, but they're not sufficient for where we are today or for the future, and they won't deliver a charter that's fit to last all the way until 2027. So beyond these practical and minimal proposals, it's time, I think, to be ambitious. Scotland, the BBC and all the nations and regions of the UK have the right to expect something truly radical from the Charter Review. A tight financial settlement, difficult though it is, can't be a reason not to do things differently. Now, as a leader of a government in a time of austerity, I know about choices that have to be made to balance the books, but I also know that we're all worse off when we allow our ambitions to be limited by the financial settlement we are dealt. A BBC that puts forward a bold proposal for Scotland, for the nations and regions, and for the UK as a whole will have in us a strong ally. A BBC that offers piecemeal solutions, I think, will fail to meet the demands and restore the trust of Scottish audiences. Now, some of that is about governance and accountability structures, things that sound really abstract, but which make a real difference to how decisions get taken and what ends up being seen on our screens. My strong belief, which of course goes beyond the Charter Review, is that responsibility for broadcasting in Scotland should transfer from Westminster to the Scottish Parliament. Now, to those who say that this is about the SNP wanting to exert political control over the BBC, I say that is quite frankly arrant nonsense. This is not a question of whether a Parliament has responsibility for the broadcasting framework, it's a question of which Parliament has that responsibility. And I think it's just common sense that the Scottish Parliament, which already has responsibility for culture, for press regulation, should also have responsibility for broadcasting. And looking at the BBC specifically, I think there should be a more federal structure with separate boards for each of the nations and each of the national boards represented on the UK board. These changes, I think, would have long-term benefits, but they need to go alongside improvements in programming as well. You know, Scotland is an outward-looking internationalist country, intensely interested and active in the world around us. But we also want to see ourselves, our daily experiences, our national story more fully reflected on our radios and television screens. You know, for example, Radio Scotland, I think, has an almost impossible job, although it does it well. But it's one station trying to reflect the life of an entire nation. A second English language radio service would provide a greater variety of programmes, and because the two channels could specialise more than Radio Scotland can, they would have stronger and more distinct identities. And it's essential that we look at television services for Scotland as well. You know, the BBC has got a very successful partnership with the Gaelic broadcaster MG Alpa. Now, BBC Alpa reaches an audience of 700,000 people across the country. Now, when you consider that census returns say that there are just 60,000 Gaelic speakers in Scotland, that's a hugely impressive performance on a limited budget, but it also demonstrates a wider demand and desire for Scottish content. So we believe that a distinct BBC Scotland TV channel should be created, empowering BBC Scotland as never before. It would help to secure the sustainability of the independent production sector. It would see more of the licence fees spent here, but more importantly, it would by some distance be the best way of making a wider and richer range of content available to Scottish viewers. You know, one of the things the last 12 months has demonstrated is that the old model of public service broadcasting, important though I think it is, and valued though I think it should be, doesn't work well enough. It no longer reflects the complex, varied and rich political and social realities of the UK. So any BBC Charter Renewal which doesn't respond to those different needs simply won't be sustainable between now and 2027. So that's why the Scottish Government will try to build a consensus behind constructive change. We'll encourage the widest possible debate within Scotland, and we'll work where we can with the UK Government and the BBC to achieve the best possible outcome. Because by doing that, we'll ensure that the work of the BBC benefits our creative economy, enriches our culture, informs our democracy, and that it does so as part of a strong, vibrant, diverse and independent media that should be so important to all of us. I think if we grasp this opportunity, it will benefit all of us across all of the nations of the UK for many, many years to come, whatever our future constitutional relationship might be. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nicola, for that very interesting and wide-ranging speech, and also for wearing an outfit that so accurately reflects our backdrop.
Not intentional.
This separate Scottish BBC channel, what would be on it? What is it you think that viewers in Scotland want from the BBC that they're not getting at the moment?
More content commissioned here, more content that reflects our life, perhaps that reflects world affairs from a particular Scottish perspective, a variety and a choice. There is, as I said, I think a demand for more Scottish content. The example I used of BBC Alapa, I think, to some extent demonstrates that. So, I think there's a huge opportunity for that. I get annoyed sometimes when people interpret that as Scotland wanting to look inwards and be parochial. It's nothing of the sort. Scotland is an outward-looking nation, but that doesn't mean we don't want to see ourselves reflected more and better than we are. And it goes to the heart of what I'm saying. I think we've got a great opportunity here to make the BBC even better than it is, and if we grasp that opportunity, there are big wins for all of us.
Isn't BBC Alapa's viewing figures, aren't they down to the fact that it's got the football? It's where the Scottish Premier League...
Well, maybe there's an appetite, not from me personally, to see more football on the television, but from others. The point is, there'll be a range of different people in different walks of life in Scotland who will, in answer to your question, what should be on it, say a multitude of different things. And perhaps that goes some way to proving the point. There is a demand there, I think, and that's a demand that as part of a broader programme of reform we should look to cater for.
The amount of money that's often talked about, Alex Salmon talked about, for funding this separate channel would be £75 million. That sounds quite low to me. It would pay for 2 series of House of Cards on Netflix, for example. So what do you think we could do with 75 million that would give enough original programming that could go up against Strictly and EastEnders?
There's lots of creative people in this audience. There's many, many more around Edinburgh just now. I think you get lots of ideas about how, with greater resources, the production sector here and the BBC and everybody that contributes to that could do great things. But what I'm trying to set out right now is, at this stage of the process in Charter Renewal, are some principles that should guide us, and they're principles that are set out with the intention of strengthening and enhancing what the BBC already does and trying to make it fit for the future. None of us can stay stuck as we are. Politicians can't do that. The other parts of the media can't do that. You're editor of a paper that has moved hugely in terms of how you engage with your readership online. We all have to move with the times and how the world is moving, and I think the BBC in this opportunity is there to do that.
But how is it going to be paid for? I mean, the BBC is being cut back. They've already lost 750 million. Channels are going, thousands of redundancies across the UK. But you think some extra money should be carved off for a new channel? Think,
there are choices to be made. Everybody just now has choices to be made about public funding that is in shorter supply than it has been in the past. And, I'm the First Minister of Scotland. We have to make these decisions as well. What I'm saying is we shouldn't allow that to eclipse the ambition that we have. And I think within that, albeit that there's less money to go round, the share of that money that is invested in Scotland should more appropriately reflect what we're seeking to do. And these are the principles, I think, that should guide this process. I'm not saying there are not tough decisions to be taken. I think some of what's been talked about in terms of the future of the BBC and narrowing the focus of the BBC is certainly the wrong direction to take. What I'm signalling is that we want to be constructive players in this discussion, but not as the Scottish Government simply giving our views, but views that we are gathering from those with an interest and seeking to take this forward on the basis of those principles.
Can you tell me a bit more about this federated structure you mentioned? So would this be governance that's federated, or would it also be commissioning, editorial vision?
Well, I think it could be a mix of all of that. Certainly, government. There's debate has been for some time, and commentary today around a new Scottish network editor. I think there's a great need to make sure that the network programming of the BBC better reflects and understands Scottish issues and the life of Scotland, not just in politics but across the piece. So I think that move to a more federal structure, I have to say we're not the first people to put this forward as a proposal. There are others who have proposed that over the years. I think is a way of helping structurally and institutionally the BBC to reflect what is the reality of how the UK is now structured and organised with parliaments in each part of the UK. But as I said in my remarks, structural changes in themselves don't deliver programming changes. That's why they have to go alongside improvements in programming.
It's just so hard to work out how it could work, especially when the BBC is spread so thinly. And I wondered what you thought, like sort of the BBC Worldwide, you know, would the profits for BBC Worldwide from Scottish programmes go to the Scotland Federated?
No,
like, you know, would all Doctor Who's profits go to Wales because it's made in Wales?
I'm not suggesting that kind of approach. I'm putting forward a principle which, you know, I'm happy that we discuss the detail of around a fairer crack at the whip for Scotland in terms of the BBC's resources.
You don't get enough funding?
Well, you know, I don't, and I suspect, I'm not going to speak for anybody in BBC Scotland, but I suspect if you did a straw poll of people in BBC Scotland, they would say they probably didn't get the resource support that they feel would benefit the organisation. So, you know, we're at an early stage of Charter Renewal, and it's important that we get it right. I think it's important for the future of the BBC, as well as those of us who enjoy the BBC, to get it right. So let's, you know, start with some clear principles. Yes, look at the detail of how that works in practice, but, you know, it's important. If we don't get the principles right, I don't think we'll get the outcome right either.
You spoke in quite a nuanced way about the way the BBC covered the referendum. Not everyone has spoken in such a nuanced way about it.
I can't think who you're talking about.
Was Alex Salmond over the top in his attacks on Nick Robinson, do you think?
Nick Robinson has himself, I think, honestly reflected on mistakes he made in coverage of the referendum. And, you know, I think it's fair to say Alec would agree with that. I was, in fact, the event that spat came out of took place not in this particular room, but in another room in the conference centre. Yeah, I was at it. You know, I don't think what happened there was Alex Salmond's fault. But anyway, that's by the by, that's in the past. What I'm trying to do today, and I hope it's taken in this spirit, is try to set out some rational explanation for why so many people feel so unhappy. Now, the BBC might not agree with all of that, but I do think there is a need to reflect on some of it, because, you know, for a politician, if we just keep saying that people who don't vote for us are wrong all the time, we won't win many elections. And I think the principle is the same. You've got to reflect. If so many people are unhappy and it's reflected in the figures, the Audience Council has made some comments. I just think it's time to have a bit of an honest reflection of that and then move on. I don't want to constantly be debating the, you know, ins and outs of the coverage of the referendum. There are bigger issues to be talking about.
They do keep putting it on the table, though, don't they?
Well, you know, it's not always from this end that it's put on the table. But anyway, what I'm saying is, you know, let's debate properly some of the issues and learn lessons and agree to disagree in some ways, but do that in a rational way. And that's what I've tried to do today, and people can judge it on its merits.
Because Alex Salmond said he won't even watch the BBC now. He switches it off. What about
you?
I
think actually there's an easy way for them to fix that. They just have to put horse racing or golf on more often, and believe me, he'll watch.
You spoke quite a bit about gender in your speech. You're the first woman First Minister, you're the first woman to lead the SNP. Your cabinet has a 50-50 male-female split. Labour in Scotland has a woman leader. The Tories in Scotland have a woman leader.
We're taking over.
Is Scotland now feminist paradise?
I wouldn't go that far. I think we're doing lots to be proud of, and, you know, let me say, I think it is a source of great pride that the three main parties are led by, you know, three strong women, and I think that's something that we should be very happy about. But there's a long way still to go. You know, I think I spoke about the media here because that's what I'm here to speak about, political parties. I've still got a long way to go to ensure greater gender equality. The business community has, the public and the third sector, we've got a long way to go still to change some attitudes. But yes, we are going in the right direction, and we've picked up pace in Scotland, and I'm actually quite optimistic that we're not far away from a tipping point on some of these issues, and I'll certainly keep doing my bit to push it forward.
You've been quite outspoken on these issues, which not all women in public life are. I was particularly interested in your comments on the New Statesman cover, which I think we can show. There we go. The motherhood trap. Why are so many successful women childless? And there's pictures of 4 women politicians looking very mournful around an empty cot. Well, it's not empty, it's got a ballot box in it.
Of course, the answer to the question is there's many different reasons, and there's possibly a different reason for each of these 4 women. Although, who knows? That did infuriate me, I have to confess. And, you know, the article by Helen Lewis is a perfectly reasonable and very good article, actually. But the New Statesman I think, put the cover out quite in advance of publishing the article, and then complained that people took issue with the cover before they read the article. Well, we couldn't read the article for a few hours after that. I mean, my objection to that is twofold. You know, it suggests that women who don't have children and are successful all make sort of cold-hearted, conscious decisions about it, which is rubbish. And also, it's just the imagery of it, the kind of forlornly looking into the empty cot. It was awful, and that's the kind of thing that I'm talking about. You know, it might sound like an exaggeration, but it's not. That will put some young women off going anywhere near politics. And that's what I mean when I say that particularly publications like the New Statesman, that have got a proud record in being, you know, progressive, they've got a responsibility to think a bit more carefully about what they put in their front cover, in my humble opinion.
The image we've got there is your tweet about it. And
I wasn't too rude, was I? No?
Jeezo. But you mentioned how much you like Twitter. The aggression of some SNP supporters online is legendary, the cybernats. Have you taken any disciplinary action? Do you think that's your role?
If SNP members cross the line on Twitter, then yes, we will, and I've made that very clear.
You haven't done yet, though?
Some people, well, you know, there are SNP members who are pulled up about things like that all the time, so we will, and I am absolutely clear about that. The point I'm going to make, though, is it's not just SNP members. In fact, many of the people who would tweet abuse in the name of the SNP are actually not SNP members, but people on all sides of the political debate do it. And I think actually we should say it's unacceptable regardless of which direction it comes from. I mean, I am somebody that enjoys Twitter, spends a lot of time on Twitter. I mean, if you read my Twitter feed on a daily basis, my goodness, your hair would curl. It is vile stuff that gets directed at me. I don't hold the leader of the Scottish Labour Party or the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party responsible for that when it's not members of their party. So let's all of us, as decent, civilised politicians, stop trying to score points off each other on it and just come together and say cyber abuse of any type, of any description, going in any direction is completely and utterly unacceptable.
Do you think it's more targeted at women?
Yes, I do. I don't think it's exclusively targeted at women. I can see a couple of people, journalists dotted around the audience that I know have had particular Twitter abuse, male journalists, so it's not entirely that. It can be targeted at your political views, journalists who, you know, say something that somebody takes issue with. But I do think there is probably an element to which women get more of it, because, you know, there are the kind of person that will tweet abuse at somebody on Twitter is probably, they're probably sitting in their bedroom, you know, in their pajamas behind their keyboard. They probably get napals, so, you know, they probably don't really like sort of strong, opinionated women. Yeah. So there is a little bit of that kind of relationship there, I think.
Have you developed a way for yourself to deal with trolls? So?
The mute button on Twitter is a wonderful, wonderful thing. It's when you block somebody on Twitter, they know you've blocked them. So I don't like doing that because I wouldn't like them to think that they've in any way impinged on my consciousness. But muting them means you've got this image of them continuing to sort of howl in the wilderness and you're completely oblivious to it. So
it's a good technique.
I like that,
you can spend a lot of the day using that button then. Just turning to the UK Labour leadership election. It costs £3 to join and you get a vote. I wondered if you've been tempted to try and join up yourself.
No. No, but I am enjoying watching.
Who would you vote for?
Oh my goodness, I don't know. I'd struggle to vote for any of them, to be honest. Jeremy Corbyn, give him his due, at least has got people talking. At least he's got people kind of inspired. Now, that's not to say I agree with him on many things, but he's got people thinking that this is something worth kind of taking part in, and it's a long time since anybody in the Labour Party seemed to do that, so I'd give him a lot of credit for that. I guess my disappointment, and this is a personal comment rather than a party political comment, given that seeing women get on in politics is so important to me, I'm really disappointed that neither of the two women have managed to kind of really shine through and seize the moment on this and be the ones that actually made people listen and think when they looked at them, you know what, we're offering something different and we're saying something different. The other three, apart from Jeremy Corbyn, just don't, I can't think of a single issue-led thing that they've really said in the campaign. And I think, if I was a Labour Party member, which I'm not, obviously, then I think I'd be really, really disappointed in that.
Who are you most scared will win?
I'm not, I'm not that bothered. I don't mean, I don't mean that to sound disrespectful. I'm one of these politicians that actually makes a point of almost probably overestimating rather than underestimating my opponents. I always assume that opponents will cause lots of trouble. So I think very carefully about people in other leaders in other parties and how they might, what challenges they might present. But I don't really look at the current Labour leadership and think, oh my goodness, I'm cowering in the corner. And fundamentally, my job is to lead the SNP and to make sure the SNP, particularly in the run-up to the election next year, is saying the things and doing the things and making the arguments that make people say we want to vote for them, regardless of who the opposition is.
So I've just been given a 5-minute warning, and so I'm going to get some questions from Twitter. I did a call out earlier today.
Not the people in their pyjamas in the bedroom, hopefully.
With no friends, yeah. So no, we'll start with this one from Matt R. Who would play you in a film about the referendum?
Well, I don't know. I can't.
Kelly MacDonald?
Yeah, but it's a bit unfair. She's a lot younger than me, so. But she's a fantastic actress, so I would certainly be happy with Kelly MacDonald.
Alexander Stevenson, how are Scottish people different from English, Welsh, Irish people?
I don't know that we are different. We're Scottish. There are characteristics of being Scottish. Personally, my grandmother was English. Most people living in Scotland, England, Wales, there'll be a mix of everything in us somewhere. And some people in the SNP, some people who voted yes, will take a different view on this, but my support for independence has never been identity driven. It's not because I'm Scottish and that somehow makes me different from people in England. It's what I describe as a more utilitarian nationalism. I want Scotland to be independent because that, I think, equips us and empowers us to change the country in the way that I would like to see the country changed.
This is from Nick Reed. When there is so much criticism of the SNP's record on health and education, do you think it's wise to want more control of the BBC?
Well, I don't accept the premise of that question, not surprisingly, and on the last opinion poll rating, neither does 62% of the Scottish population, but I take nothing for granted. I'm proud of the record we've got on health and education. On health, the time you wait for a hospital operation now is much lower than it was when we were first in office. On education, we've delivered I think a very important reform through Curriculum for Excellence. We've done work that's been controversial in our college sector, but has meant that people going to college in Scotland are much more likely to come out with a qualification that will equip them for the workforce, and youth unemployment is actually at a 5-year low in Scotland just now, so there's a relationship there. So I'll defend our record and I'll do it proudly, but I'm also not the kind of politician that is very comfortable resting on laurels. There are things I want to do more of. There are things I want to do better. So when we're seeking another term in office in the election next year, it will be very much based on, yes, a defence of what I think is a good record and one to be proud of, but much more about what I want us to do to equip the country for the 5, 10, 20 years ahead.
This question, I think, must be from someone in England who would like to vote for you. Michael Fraser, will the SNP field candidates south of the border, perhaps as far as York? But no further.
Probably not. I mean, I'm not saying I've never been tempted, but I think we probably should stick to Scotland.
But I like the probably in there. It's quite sort of
But
intriguing.
You know what? I made this a big thing during the general election campaign, and although the general election campaign in terms of the composition of the House of Commons didn't turn out as people predicted during the campaign, I still mean this. As long as we're in the Westminster Parliament, part of the Westminster system, I want the SNP to try to work with others for the kind of politics that we support, and we'll make every attempt to do that, whoever the new Labour leader ends up being.
And this is the last question from someone called Harry Butler. Are you still the most dangerous woman in Britain?
I don't think I ever was. I don't think somebody clad head to toe in pink can ever be described as dangerous, but
it's a good cover.
I have to say, I've said it before and I'll say it again, it is by far the nicest thing the Daily Mail has ever said about me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Nicola Sturgeon.